Venga, ya se van uniendo los...
Sí. The recording has started. Okay.
Sí, ¿verdad? Venga, molt bé.
Perfecta. Una cosa.
Vale. Ahora ya debes estar viendo ya mi pantalla, ¿no?
Espera. Sí, perfecto. ¿Quieres cambiar un poco la slides para verlo? Sí, sí cambia.
Sí, funciona, ¿no?
Sí, perfecto, sí funciona. Muy bien. Sergio, ¿lo quieres hacer en inglés o en castellano?
Lo que me digáis.
Quizás mejor en inglés, porque también tenemos un grupo de PhD students.
Vale.
Entonces, claro, no somos solo nosotros.
Vale, sí, no hay problema.
Del faculty, quiero decir. Y por cierto, te presentaré yo, ¿vale? Alex, no estoy seguro si estará. Al final tendría que ir su madre está enferma, entonces no sé si estará.
Bueno.
Okay, well, let me check this. I think we can wait for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're right. We should be okay. Okay, so let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear us? It's a pleasure to invite Sergio Espuelas. Sergio is an associate professor at the Department of Economic History at the Universitat of Barcelona. Sergio's research interests are on public spending, and especially in relation to political regimes. Today he's gonna talk about democracy and primary education spending in Spain during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He will present this work. It's a joint work with Paula Azar from the University of Montevideo. So thank you very much, Sergio, for presenting, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me and for this nice presentation, and thank you also to Alex for organizing this, even if he isn't here today. Well, as Nectario said, I'm going to present this paper, this joint paper with Paola Azar, on democracy and primary education spending in Spain between 1902 and 1922. And well, as the title indicates, the idea is to analyze the impact of democracy or political factors more generally on primary education investment in Spain during this time period. So the motivation for this is that there is actually an open debate on the role of democracy on the expansion of primary education. We can find theories suggesting that there is a positive impact of democracy on the expansion of education. The idea is that basically the extension of voting rights has a positive impact on the demand for education, and therefore governments invest more on education. But there are also many theories saying that democracy or that democracies not always invest more on education than non-democratic governments do. Basically because in many places, say these theories, in many places, the expansion of education of primary education in this case is basically the result of top-down reforms that governments implement for reasons that has little to do with the demands of the population. For example, in order to promote industrialization, or even to try to indoctrinate the population under non-democratic governments, like under Bismarck in Germany or in France under Napoleon, for example. No? So we have these two alternative theories, let's say, about the role of democracy in the development of education. And then there are some authors like Peter Linder who suggest that in order to explain these apparent contradictions between these two theories, these theories predicting a positive impact or predicting no positive impact of education, we need to look at the actual workings of democracy, the actual workings of democracy, and at the actual design of the education system. And Linder, for example, gives the example of the German case. He basically says that in non-democratic Prussia in the 19th century, the education system was decentralized, and this allowed more industrialized and more urbanized areas within Germany during that period to invest in education. So what he says is that basically that apparently, even if Germany or Prussia at that time was a non-democratic country, the decentralization of the education system allowed for these more industrialized and more urbanized regions that had a bigger demand for education to actually invest in education, even if the central government was not investing in education. So we kind of gather this idea that we need to look at the details of the actual working of the political system to analyze the impact of education, and we focus on the Spanish case during this period, basically to analyze whether democratic imperfections hindered government efforts to promote education expansion, as I say here. And we believe that Spain is an interesting case for basically for two reasons. On the one hand, Spain, as many other European countries since the late 19th century, tried to promote education expansion from above, if you wish. Basically, in 1902, the education system was centralized because the government was trying to promote education from above, as I said. But the results were rather poor. Okay, I'll say a few things about this, a few more things about this in a second. But basically, literacy increased, but very, very slowly. So we wanted to see whether this slow improvement in education, even though the government was actually trying to promote education from above, was related to the actual working of democracy in Spain. And there's the second interesting thing about the Spanish case. And Spain was during this time period officially a democratic country. There were general elections and there was universal male suffrage. So all men were allowed to vote. But elections weren't completely clean. Actually, corruption was very common, and the government was in fact able to impose the electoral results, was able to manipulate the electoral results and to impose the electoral results decided by the government. Moreover, this ability, or what is interesting in the Spanish case, at least from the perspective of the empirical design, is that this ability of the government to impose an electoral outcome decreased over time and across provinces. Gradually, elections became more competitive in some electoral districts and in some provinces, and some independent candidates, I will elaborate a little bit more on this in a second, that were called the propios, increased. And these propios used to be candidates that relied extensively, as I say here, on clientelistic policies. So we exploit this variation in the level of electoral competition and in the, let's say, in the level of political patronage or political clientelism in order to analyze the impact of these two factors on the evolution of education spending. And basically what we find is that the lack of political competition in the Spanish case and political patronage actually lowered education investment during this time period. And we also find that voter turnout had a positive effect, but this effect wasn't big enough to compensate for the negative effect of these political market imperfections, let's say. Okay, so this is basically the outline of the presentation. Now I'm going to give you a bit more historical background on the workings of the education system and the political system. And then I'll move to the empirical analysis. And finally, I'll try to summarize very briefly the conclusions. Okay. In the case of the education system, as I said before, in 1902, the Spanish government decided to centralize primary education. Before 1902, primary education was basically financed by the local governments in a decentralized way. But after the military defeat during the War of Cuba in front of the US, the Spanish government decided to try to promote education expansion in order to actually promote industrialization and promote the modernization of the country. The loss of the colonies in Cuba was like a dramatic change for the government, and actually the military defeat was also very dramatic for the government in the sense that it showed how weak was the Spanish state at the moment. So the objective with this reform, trying to centralize education, was to some extent to dignify the international, let's say, reputation of Spain. The reform basically consisted on this centralization of primary education. Basically, the central government took over the payment of primary school teachers, the wage of primary school teachers, and local governments actually remained in charge of school buildings and the construction of new schools and keeping these schools in good conditions in general. But the bulk of primary education spending, which was the payment of the wage of the teachers, now was in charge of the central government. In general, the results, as I said before, were rather poor. Literacy rates increased from around 45% of the population in 1900 to 60% of the population literate in 1920, but 40% of the population remained illiterate after 20 years of the reform. So even though there were some progress, in general, the improvements were rather poor, as I said before. And if we look at the evolution of government spending, we see something similar to what we were able to see in these maps here, showing the literacy rates across Spanish provinces. Here you can see that there was a clear north-south divide. with the northern provinces with higher literacy rates than the southern provinces, and this is true for 1900 and for 1920. And when we look at the evolution of government spending on education, we find something similar. The government was investing more in primary education in the northern provinces by 1905, and still was investing more in the northern provinces by 1920. So even though education spending was centralized, the central government was to some extent replicating the same patterns that we were able to see before this decentralization process. So we wanted to see to what extent this could be explained by political factors. Okay. Then let me give you some background on the workings of the political system in Spain during this period. So as I said, Spain was officially a democratic country with general elections and so on. Since 1991, actually the first general elections with universal male suffrage were in 1891. But even though there were general elections, the government was able to, as I said before, to manipulate and to control the election results. Basically, the two main parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, were able to alternate in power constantly. So each party used to win one election. So in one election, the Liberal Party won the elections, and then in the next elections, the Conservative Party always won the elections, and so on. And this was possible basically because the two parties agreed to alternate in power, as I see here, or in government, by means of rigged elections and by means of corruption. No? So before each election, these two political parties, used to meet, and then they decided or they planned the election results, and then and this was called the encasillado. And then the government used to send to the minister of the Interior actually used to send the list of the official candidates, so the list of who should win in each electoral districts the elections according to this plan devised by both the Liberal and the Conservative Party. And then the local elites, once they received this information about who should win the elections in their local district, they were able to enforce, let's say, this national agreement on the results of the elections, and in order to implement this encasillado, these local elites used several means. Basically, corruption or direct corruption, simply buying votes from the population, sometimes manipulating the vote count, sometimes intimidating the population in order to force them to vote for the official candidate, and also using widespread political patronage, basically trying to buy electoral support from specific voters in exchange of, let's say, political favors, investing in public works or hiring someone to work in the public administration and so on. This system actually worked pretty well since the beginning of the 20th century until, let's say, the First World War. And then gradually the system started to weaken, and the government find it more and more difficult to implement these planned electoral results, this encasillado. And then basically, especially in big cities, the elections became increasingly competitive. This means that the government was increasingly unable to implement the encasillado, so to make sure that the official candidates were elected in the districts in big cities, in the electoral districts of big cities. And as a result, what we call minority parties, this means minority parties that were not the Liberal or the Conservative Party, started to gain more political representation, particularly in these big cities. And then as a reaction to this increasing political competition, many candidates that had strong relationships with these local elites, when they saw that the central government was unable to impose the official candidates in order to survive politically, let's say, many of these candidates, of these traditionally official candidates, decided to also skip this alternation in power that the Liberal and the Conservative Party tried to implement, and many of them simply make use of their connections with the local elites to ensure their re-election. So this was an alternative way that this alternation in power by the Liberal and the Conservative parties also started to disappear, or started to erode, let's say. In the first case, we are unable to observe directly all the mechanisms that the government was using to limit political competition, but we can observe the political representation that these minority parties were achieving. So we use this share of minority parties as a proxy, let's say, for increased political competition. And in the case of these MPs that were constantly elected in their district, which were called the propios MPs, and who were also candidates that were not, let's say, respecting the alternation system agreed by the Liberal and the Conservative Party, but using or making an extensive use of these clientelistic ties that they had with the local elites. We use this as a proxy for, in this case, increased political patronage. So political clientelism or political patronage was used at least by the official parties in this case during this period, but these propios candidates actually made a more intensive use of these clientelistic ties. So we use this as a proxy for increased political patronage. So basically what we do is we exploit the variation that we observe in these two variables in order to analyze the impact of political competition and political clientelism on the evolution of education spending. So we have data for 45 provinces during this time period. We follow this paper by Marta Curto and co-authors, where they investigate the impact of political factors on the allocation of investment, of the central government investment in public works in Spain, and they build a database on electoral outcomes for Spain for the period before 1914, I think. So they actually focus on a period which is a bit earlier than our time period. And in addition to these electoral variables that I'm going to explain you in a second in a more detailed way, we also have information on the evolution of on the allocation actually of the central government primary education spending across Spanish provinces. Okay. Then as for the political variables, these are the political variables that we have and that are the focus or the main interest of our analysis. Then, as I said, in order to analyze the impact of political competition, we use this variable, which is the share of minority party seats, which are basically all political parties with political representation that were not the Liberal and the Conservative Party. And we also use as a potential proxy for political competition, the share of dynastic opposition seats. The dynastic parties were the Liberal and the Conservative Party. And in addition to this increase in the share of these minority parties, sometimes when the alternation system was actually weakening, what we observe in some elections is that even some conservative candidates or some liberal candidates didn't respect the general agreement on the alternation in power. And in some elections, the opposition of the dynastic party, so the liberal opposition or the conservative opposition, sometimes also increased. And we also use this as a potential proxy for political competition. And the expected sign of this variable is, in principle, negative. The reason is that we expect that limited electoral competition should translate into lower education spending, basically because the government in this case was actually able to ignore the swing voters, as I say here, or actually was able to ignore a share of the population potentially demanding more education. However, this may change if electoral competition increases, and this may force the government actually to start investing in this education where, for whatever reason, electoral competition is increasing faster, let's say. So in order to capture for this, or to control for this, we have also included the square of these two variables. So the square of the share of the minority party seats and the square of the share of the dynastic opposition seats to test whether increased political opposition translates into higher education investment in this case. Then to analyze the impact of political patronage, we focus on this variable, which is the share of these propios MPs, which are these candidates that, when electoral competition increased, decided to ignore the alternation in power agreed by the Liberal and the Conservative Party and decided to make an intensive or a very extensive, actually, use of clientelist ties with the local elites to reinforce or to make sure that they were re-elected. And here we expect a negative sign. Basically because education is a public good that is offered to the general population. Once you build a school in a small city or in a town, in principle, all children in that village or in that town or in that small city are allowed to go to this school, and this is not the kind of public investment that you can address specifically to some voters. Like for example, you can do in the case of the investment in public works, that you can hire some voters that you know for some reason that they have voted for your candidate, so you can actually compensate your electoral supporters with this public investment in public works or hiring people to work in the public administration and so on and so on. In the case of education, is much more difficult to focus on some specific voters because it is by definition a public good. So initially we expect this variable to have a negative impact. Okay. And then in the case of, we also include electoral participation or voter turnout. Initially, the expected sign is positive, but given the Spanish context where corruption was widespread and so on, we are not expecting a very big impact of this variable. And finally, we also include the relative seniority of MPs. Basically, we expect MPs with more experience or with with longer careers in the parliament, maybe they have more influence to gather money to invest in education in their electoral districts. Okay. Well, this is basically the education with the equation we are going to estimate with where this political bar list includes all these variables here. We include all the regressions include province fixed effects and time fixed effects. We cluster the standard errors by province, and we assume that that education spending is influenced by the results of the nearest previous elections. Okay, so we assume that the government was responding to the last elections when making their investments. And as control variables, we include the share of school-age children, the literacy rate, to try to proxy the potential demand for education and the education of the level of education of parents. We include the share of MPs that enter the parliament following the Article 29, which was a particularity of the Spanish political system. I can say a few more things about this later if you wish. And we control for the GDP per capita, population density, and the share of population over 60 years old. Okay, and these are the regression results. Here, well, you can see that the share of minority seats had a negative and significant, statistically significant impact on the investment on primary education. So this means that the government was actually punishing, let's say, the provinces that were not supporting the alternation system. So the government was actually, this suggests that the government was actually able to ignore these swing voters in these provinces where the share of minority seats were higher. The share of propiots, that remember is our proxy for a political patronage, also has a negative impact. So in the provinces where this, with a higher share of propios MPs, investment in education was lower, which is consistent with this expectance that political representatives don't make use of education to try to gather electoral support from specific voters, because this is not the kind of public spending that you can allocate to specific voters. And then in the case of voter turnout, we find a positive and a significant effect. Okay? The share of the dynastic opposition seats shows a negative impact, but it's not significant. And seniority in general, the seniority of MPs again is not significant. Okay. In terms of magnitude, so how big was the impact of the share of minority seats, the share of propios, and the electoral participation? What we find is that an increase of 1 standard deviation translates, in the case of the share of minority seats, into a reduction of 12% of the standard deviation of education spending, which is a quite big reduction in education spending. In the share of propios, the reduction is of 13%, and in the case of voter turnout, a 1 standard deviation involves an increase of 5%. So what we can see here is that the negative impact of these two political variables is much bigger than the positive impact of voter turnout, which, as I said before, actually is not completely surprising in a context like the Spanish context, where the elections were actually not very competitive and corruption was widespread and so on. Okay, then in addition to this, we wanted to test whether the impact of the share of minority seats and the share of dynastic opposition seats changes when we include the square of these variables. And in general, what we find is that in the case of the share of minority seats, actually the square of this variable turns positive, suggesting that when political competition actually increased, then the government started to invest more in these provinces where political competition or the representation of alternative political parties increased. Then the government decided to invest more in education in these provinces or electoral districts. But we find no statistically significant results in the case of the share of the dynastic opposition seats. The impact of the share of propios and the voter turnout remains pretty similar as in the previous regressions. And then if we calculate the total marginal effect of the share of minority seats, what we find is that the net impact of this minority parties representation only becomes positive when they represent more of 65% of the seats of the electoral seats in a given province. So the central government actually only started to invest more in education in these provinces where electoral competition was increasing, when these minority parties actually became majoritarian in some provinces. In the case of Spain, this only happened in Barcelona, maybe, and maybe some other provinces, Cadiz, maybe Seville at some point in our time period. So only in a very few cases in our sample. So this means that in general, this punishment strategy, so this capacity of the government to ignore the swing voters and invest less in education that were not respecting this alternation system, it prevailed over this attraction strategy to try to gather electoral support from the provinces voting for these minority parties. Okay. Then finally, as I said, this electoral competition especially increased in big cities. So we wanted to test whether this effect of the minority seats remains when we control for the impact of urbanization, let's say. And then in this table we basically include the share of non-rural employment to try to capture the share of non-rural employment per province to capture the impact of urbanization. And then we also include the interaction of this share of non-rural employment with the share of minority seats and the share of dynastic seats. Here, in the case of the share of dynastic opposition seats, again, we find no statistical effect. In the case of the share of minority seats, of the minority party seats, we find that actually there was a sort of rural penalty, if you wish. So the government was more responsive to the increase of the share of minority seats in less rural areas because we can observe this positive impact. So let's say 10% of minority seats in urban provinces like Barcelona had a more positive impact on education spending than a 10% share of minority seats in a rural a province like, for example, Badajoz, let's say. But even after controlling for this, we still observe this non-linear effect of the share of minority seats. So initially the effect was negative, and then it turns a positive, but again only for a few cases. Okay. So in general, the idea is that in general this this punishment strategy of the government towards provinces voting for the minority seats was predominant during all this time period. Then, in addition to this, we ran some robustness checks. We ran this Pesaran test for a spatial correlation, and we find no evidence of a spatial correlation. We also ran the regressions controlling for heteros and serial autocorrelation, and the results were basically the same. And we also replicate the results using alternative definition of schooling outliers. And again, the results were basically the same. So to conclude, what we find is that political factors in the case of Spain were actually very important in order to understand or to explain the evolution of education investment after the centralization process that started in 1902. Basically, the lack of electoral competition and political patronage lowered education investment. The government reacted to increase political competition, but in general, the government was actually quite immune, let's say, to this increased electoral competition, because in general, or taking Spain as a whole, the government was during the whole time period able to control, or to a large extent, to control the electoral results. And in the case of voter turnout, we find the same. The government responded to increasing political participation, but this response by the government was not enough to compensate for the negative effect of political patronage and the lack of political party competition. And thank you. This would be all that I wanted to share with you. And now I'd be happy to get comments from all of you.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Let me see if we have any questions on. Okay, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay. So yeah, Carlos Sarkos has a question. Carlos, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Nectar. My question is how the variables, the minority seats variable and the dynasty opposition variable and also the proprius variable are related, which are the correlations, because since they go together in the analysis, I don't know if this might be problematic. And then just, and if you could repeat the definitions, because maybe I got a little bit lost, but I'm interested in how the variables are related between them.
Okay. Nectario, should I answer now or should I gather questions and then answer?
Yes, please. Have some time for questions. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay. So, sorry, Nectario, I didn't.
Yeah, please. Please go ahead to respond. Okay. To respond to Carlos's question.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's a good point. We basically take all the political representatives, and then we classify them according. We classify them according if they belong to one of these minority parties, if they belong to one of these, to the conservative or the liberal party that stays in the opposition, and then we have these proprios, which are candidates that were permanently elected, but they didn't belong to the minority parties or to the opposition parties. Okay, and then our, let's say, our reference here are the are the MPs that were actually members or that were supporting the government. Okay, is our reference or our benchmark in the analysis. So they are to some extent related. Now I don't have the data. I mean, I don't have in mind the potential correlation matrix.
Then if I'm understanding what you're saying, then minority seats is other parties. Propios is kind of independent candidates. And then dynasty opposition might be both a minority seat or a propio that is against the main parties or something like that. Might be part of those two groups.
No, we basically have the MPs belonging to the Conservative Party, MPs belonging to the Liberal Party, MPs belonging to other parties, and then these independent candidates. Okay, so in the case of minority and independent candidates, I think it's rather clear. And then when the Conservative parties, when the Conservative Party was in government, the dynastic opposition were the MPs of the Liberal Party, and when the Liberal Party was in the government, the dynastic opposition was the MPs of the Conservative Party. Okay?
Then it's like the imbalance between the two main parties. This is kind of the variable.
In the case of the dynastic opposition set, yes.
But the point is that if the electoral results are manipulated, this sounds like kind of trivial, no, conceptually, because they have agreed upon this on a more or less extent, no?
Yeah, the point is that election results were manipulated, but the ability of the government to manipulate the election results changed over time and across provinces. So even if these two parties actually agreed on who should be the official candidates elected in each electoral district, that what you find is that in some elections, for example, some liberal candidates didn't respect the national agreement, and actually they ran for the elections, they made campaign, and they were eventually elected. So that's why we use it as a potential proxy for political competition, even if we find no effect in this case, which suggests that they were, in general terms, respecting the electoral term, and basically that when they didn't respect this alternation in power, they didn't push for increasing education spending.
And have you considered, I don't know if it has sense for educational spending, but maybe interaction effects between minority parties and propios, kind of an accumulation effect of opposing forces or forces that are not under the control of the government? I don't know. Maybe it's senseless what I'm saying, but.
Well, that's a good point. It makes sense. There could be a kind of an accumulation effect. We didn't think about it. That sounds like a potentially good idea. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question is by Susana Iranzo, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a nice paper.
Just a minute, I can.
Sorry, there is an info. If you can, Nectarios, just.
Yeah. Okay.
And put it low. Yeah. Now, okay. Now it's okay. I think. I'm here in the room with Nectarios, and we each one has his own computer, so there was this echo. So, Sergio, I have one question and two related comments.
Okay.
The question is about the elections. So, how many elections do you have, and what elections are these? These are central government elections, because you have roughly 950 observations in most models. There are like 50 provinces or so, right? So 50 times 20. So yeah, I wonder what is really the unit of analysis for the elections. And then based on that, I mean, my comments will are related to that. So if you wanna please clarify this for me first.
Yes. Elections were basically every 2 years. So the first election is in 1900, then in 1902, then in 1904, and so on. And then I think that after 1917, we have one election per year because there was more political turmoil, and then elections became more frequent, let's say. So we have a lot of elections, and all these are general elections to the elections to the central government, let's say.
Okay. So yeah. So then my comments are the following. So even though your dependent variable is the spending, education spending, which takes time in time t, but as you said, there is quite a lot of persistence, as you show us with those maps at the beginning. There is quite a lot of persistence in this spending by province. So I wonder whether you have some endogeneity issue, some reverse causality issue, right? Because those provinces with literate rates, with higher literate rates, will probably tend to be more liberal as well, right? No, the proxy for democracy is the share of these minority parties. But anyway, you see what I mean, that there might be this reverse causality going on. And so related to that, I wonder whether you had considered perhaps a cleaner, what could be a cleaner identification strategy if you could implement it, which is regression discontinuity based on this on the share of this minority party being above or below some threshold, some relevant threshold. Naturally, percent, but I don't know whether probably these minority parties will never get 50%. But some threshold that you consider then the relevance. I mean, this minority party becomes really relevant, which is what you are really doing with the quadratic term, right? So with the quadratic term, actually, you could calculate this inflation point. So, and perhaps that happens to be, I don't know, the share of the minority party being 20%. I'm making this up, right? So I wonder whether you could then implement, regression discontinuity and look at the provinces where the share of the minority party are just above this 20%, if that is the threshold, and those where the share is right below 20%, and try to get identification from that. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, actually, thank you very much for this later comment. This sounds promising. Actually, we didn't think about this, but I think it's something that we could easily do actually. So we'll try. We'll try this and see whether we can find any result with this. And then this is actually related to this potential endogeneity problem that we have. And then that's true that we have a lot of persistence. And when we started with this at the beginning, we weren't very worried about this potential endogeneity problem because we thought, okay, imagine that we have these provinces that were not giving political support to the government, and because they were, for example, receiving less investment in education. And then we thought, well, this shouldn't be a problem if we are able to find these stable correlations. This means that the government actually is not trying to gather political support from these provinces by increasing education spending. but it's obvious that this actually could be inflating our coefficients. So yeah, we know that we are aware about this potential endogeneity problem, and we are now trying to think about potential ways to fix it. We were thinking about using some kind of instrument for this, for example, previous tradition of republicanism, because many of the minority parties were Republican parties, and there was a short period between 1868 and 1874 where there were general elections, and we were thinking about using this as an instrument for the increase in the share of minority parties from 1900s onwards. But we need to think about this, and thank you for this idea on the education discontinuity strategy, because I think it
no, but adding on this, Sergio, I think that actually the regression discontinuity design will also help you deal with the endogeneity. I think that it is it is less or more defendable. The results will be more defendable if you identify them out with the regression discontinuity that with this
instrument.
Right, because if you just look at only these provinces where that are right above and right below, I think that, well, not completely, right? The endogeneity is very difficult to get rid of, but at least that I think is a little bit better in terms of a little bit. The problem will not be so as serious. The endogeneity problem, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I buy your argument. We were thinking about this instrument, but I like it better, this regression discontinuity strategy. So yeah, I totally agree.
Thank you for the comments. And so on in the same line, but on a different maybe talk. I was thinking about these minority party proxy for political competition. So at the same time, the internationally, we also have the rise of those parties, right? Say in general, the left-wing movement, and more representation, more political competition. So how is your variable changing over time? And I'm asking this also from a technical point of view. You are using time fixed effects. So maybe if minority parties share increase over time, maybe this is highly correlated with your time dummies. So and then you need to think a bit harder about how you go about the time dummies and about this proxy. This was one question, and maybe another one, maybe minor one. I didn't see in the maps the Basque Country. So just this is a historical background, I guess. So it was not part of the central government's expenditure, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Darius. In the case of the Basque Country, the reason is historical, let's say. The investment in primary education in the Basque Country and in Navarra, which is also missing here, didn't depend on the central government, and the investment was dependent on the provincial governments, I think. el gobierno foral. Yeah? Then related to the first comment, yep, there is, well, in our case, in the paper there is one graph showing the evolution of this minority seats. There isn't a clear trend over time. To some extent, because the design of the Spanish political system made to some extent the government immune to these general trends in the international context. So the minority parties basically increased after 1917, 1916, more or less.
Right.
And then there is an increase in 1907, then there is a little decrease. So there is kind of variation, and when there is a clearer increases after World War I, when actually the central government weakened more clearly. But there isn't a clear trend over time.
Okay.
Yeah, and even after the war, I mean, in 1920, again we can see again a decrease in the share of minority parties. So this is not completely constant over time. Yeah, so I wouldn't say this is a big problem in our data.
Okay.
I think it's a good point.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Do we have any other question? Oscar, please go ahead.
Hi. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, because maybe you have said and I don't take it. But which is the time relation between the government expenditure in education and the election time? That is is the government expenditure in education in the same year than election year, are a mean of the 2 years of the government, or is the last year?
Yeah, what we take is, I mean, we assume that the government spending on education in 1 year depends on the last available electoral results. And for the years where there were elections, we take the same year. Okay, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Then, okay, I would like to thank you, Sergio, for this nice and interesting presentation about the Spanish education system, primary education, and democracy in the early 20th century. I really enjoyed your paper, and thank you all for participating and for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Nectarios, for the invitation, and thank you very much for all the comments.
Yeah. Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks a lot.